Many of you know that I used to work for the Jesuit Refugee Service. I was based in Rome. One of the areas where I often found myself working was in Lebanon. I was in Beirut a lot because there were a lot of refugees there. Now, the Beirut I grew up with in the news was a Beirut at war. U.S. Embassy was bombed there, you'll remember. It's the headquarters of Hezbollah. Then came the Syrian occupation, and then now it's home to 2 million Syrian refugees. So I had a certain image, maybe a prejudice, of how unsafe this city would be. But I was curious to see the city. And during one of my early trips, after a particularly long string of meetings, I asked Roy, our local education coordinator, if he would show me around the city a bit. There's a certain faded beauty to Beirut, which used to be called the Paris of the Middle East, with the remains of a bygone era all around you. Roy suggested we go to Harissa, up the mountain to the famous shrine of Our Lady of Lebanon. It's one of the major Christian shrines in the country and a site of refuge for many Christians during the Civil War of the late 70s. Now, since Roy didn't drive, he told me he was going to invite his friend Jessica because she had been wanting to go up to Harissa. But I have to warn you, he said, please, you need to know about Jessica. And he paused for dramatic effect. Jessica may be the worst driver in Beirut. Great, I thought. What am I getting myself into? I was supposed to meet Roy and Jessica outside the Jesuit residence at 6 p.m. the next evening. Soon enough, we were on our way north of the city, and I realized that Roy was not exaggerating. Jessica may actually have been the worst driver in the city. She looked at you when she was talking to you, which meant half the time her eyes were off the road. And when she was talking to me in the back seat, instead of looking in the mirror, she turned her head. Then Roy would remind her to look at the road, and then they would argue in Arabic, and the cycle continued all the way up. As we made our way up the mountain, Roy seemed very tense. Jessica seemed a bit upset. I hadn't understood what they had been arguing about, so I had no idea what was going on. But it was very dark, and I couldn't make heads or tails of where we were. Suddenly, without warning, Roy barked something in Arabic and pointed to the left as Jessica hit the brakes, made a sharp left turn. We drove into an empty parking lot as the two of them continued to argue. Jessica came to an abrupt stop in front of another car, which suddenly turned its headlights on. High beams. And we were all momentarily blinded. Roy turns around and says, "Get out of the car." I froze. What did he say? "Get out of the car," he repeated. "Here?" I asked. "Yes, we're changing cars." Changing cars. I'd seen way too many movies. I looked and saw nothing but darkness around us, except where the lights were coming from the car right in front of us. What's going on? I kept thinking. And then it suddenly dawned on me. This is how it's going to end. I never expected that this is how it was going to end, that I was being kidnapped. At the same time that this was happening, a Jesuit had just been kidnapped in Afghanistan, and they were negotiating for his release. And oh my God, now it's going to be me. I'm being kidnapped. Are the Jesuits even going to pay for me? Maybe that's Hezbollah in the other car. And as soon as this realization happened, something else happened to me. I found myself, hearing the words of my 4th grade nun, praying the act of contrition. And I started on a litany of Our Fathers. I can still see myself praying it. Apparently that's what I do when I'm being kidnapped. I pray the Our Father. Roy and Jessica came over and Roy said, "What's taking you so long?" And I said, "Where are you taking me?" He said, "What are you talking about? Taking you? To Harissa. We're changing cars because Jessica's car won't make it up the mountain." "It will," Jessica interrupted, and they argued again. "So we're going to get in my friend Fadi's car, and he'll drive us the rest of the way." And then they realized that the look of terror on my face and that I hadn't been moving Jessica said something to Roy in Arabic, and then they both started laughing. Laughing so hard, in fact, that Fadi came out of his car to see what was happening. And Roy turned to me with tears in his eyes and laughing so hard he could scarcely talk and said, "Did you think we were kidnapping you?" Well, yes, I yelled back. "You're arguing in Arabic. You're very tense. She takes a sharp turn into a dark parking lot. High beams blind us. We're in Beirut, and you tell me to get out and change cars. What else am I supposed to think?" By this time, Fadi's laughing, and he's on the floor, really laughing on the ground because he's laughing so hard. I, on the other hand, am still praying my Our Fathers at this point. I'm not so sure how many of them I said, but it was at least a good rosary. So what does this have to do with the first Sunday of Lent? Well, in Deuteronomy, we hear that the story of temptation and return is the story of the people of Israel. Because they kept turning away from God, they kept trying other gods, they disobeyed God's law. They thought they could do it all themselves. And when things get difficult, eventually they turn to God. And God is always there to welcome them back. Because God is always faithful. And God is always loving. And no matter what people do, God is there in their midst. God is calling them back. Our second reading today from Romans says that if you call upon the name of God, you will be saved. But the question is, are we going to trust God or not? Because that's what always caused the people trouble. Or we might ask about ourselves, am I going to go at this alone, or am I going to ask for help? Am I going to rely on myself, or am I going to rely on God? That's always been my big temptation. Personally, my big temptation has always been to go at it alone. We all have our own temptations, and so we pray every day, lead us not into temptation, which is apparently what I do when I'm being kidnapped. I would like to think that at that point I chose to rely on God. In today's gospel, we hear that even Jesus was faced with temptations for power and for authority. And Jesus did not give in, which is what we human beings do often. And we do so sometimes in a terrible way, like when we humiliate people and strip them of their human dignity, when we demonize others, when we lord it over those who are in authority, over whom we are in authority, when we rejoice in the misfortunes of others, when we call each other names. That's simply giving in to the worst of our human temptations, to play God, to think that you are God, and you see it on the news every day. Am I really going to place my trust and hope in God? Or am I going to hope and trust in myself? That's the question I keep asking every time I think of my adventure in Beirut. Am I really going to trust God as Jesus did? Am I? I think that, brothers and sisters, is the real question of Lent.